They stopped him at the gate, not because he did anything wrong, but because they couldn't imagine he belonged there. A young gate agent named Haley saw Thomas Ellison, a calm, well-dressed black man holding a first-class boarding pass, and assumed he was out of place. She stalled. She called security. She made him wait. But when they picked Thomas, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know Thomas Ellison was the CEO of the company supplying fresh meals to their airline under a $40 million 0-cents contract. And what came next wasn't just justice. It was a quiet reckoning that reached all the way to corporate boardrooms. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Morning light spilled through the high glass windows of JFK Terminal 4. The air was still. Passengers scrolled their phones. And at Gate 22, a man stood silently beside a glass wall, dignified, waiting, and unknowingly setting off a chain of consequences that would shake an entire system. It was 6:45 a.m. when Thomas Ellison stepped into Terminal 4 at JFK. The airport hummed with early travelers in distant intercoms, but for Thomas, it was just another morning in a long line of them. His charcoal suit was pressed to perfection. The leather handles of his garment bag creaked softly in his left hand, and the crisp first-class boarding pass rested securely in his right. He wasn't flashy, never had been, but he moved like someone who'd earned his space, quiet, measured, and without hesitation. At Gate 22, only a few passengers milled about. Some were sipping lukewarm coffee. Others scrolled mindlessly through their phones. Thomas approached the boarding desk with a polite nod and handed over his pass to the young woman behind the counter. She didn't scan it. Instead, her eyes moved up to his face, paused, then slowly down again to the ticket. The moment hung oddly in the air. Thick, uncertain. "This lane is for premium boarding only," she said, the edge in her voice sharper than necessary. "I know," Thomas replied evenly. Still, she didn't move. The scanner light remained dark. She whispered something to a nearby colleague, who turned slightly to glance at Thomas. A flicker of unease passed between them, though no words were spoken. Then came the request. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem with the ticket?" "It's just a security check," she mumbled. He handed over his license without protest, though they both knew this wasn't standard. The ID sat untouched on the counter as the gate agent stepped away, whispering again, this time to a uniformed man near the security post. A silence settled. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that thickens behind your ribs. Have you ever felt someone doubt you before a word even left your mouth? Thomas knew this script. He had seen it play out before. But this time, something in the air shifted. Not rage, not fear, just clarity. He stepped to the side. He wouldn't give them what they were looking for. No raised voice, no reaction. Just a moment of stillness in a world that still hadn't learned to see beyond assumptions. And in that quiet, the story truly began. The security guard arrived without speaking. Stocky, expressionless, with a hand resting near his belt. He stopped just to the right of Thomas and stood there, not to assist, but to observe. His eyes moved over Thomas like he was evaluating a risk, not a customer. No questions, no explanations, just a silent wall forming. The boarding area grew tense, though most travelers were still too distracted to notice, except for one businessman in a gray pullover, who leaned slightly toward the counter and whispered, "Is he causing trouble or something?" Thomas heard it. Of course he did. But he didn't flinch. He stepped a few feet farther from the desk, calmly placing himself out of the way. His boarding pass was still in his hand. His license still lay untouched on the counter. And yet somehow, the burden of justification had shifted to him. There was no scene, no shouting, just the quiet, suffocating presumption that he didn't belong where he stood. That's the thing about moments like these. They don't begin with loud accusations. They begin with disbelief in your presence, with the lingering question behind someone's eyes, why are you here? Have you ever been made to feel like you were trespassing in a space you've rightfully earned? Thomas knew this wasn't just about a gate or a seat. It was about the invisible checklist being marked in someone's head, the mental sorting of who belongs and who should be double-checked. The gate agent returned, eyes darting between Thomas and the security officer. "We're just resolving a small issue," she said loudly to no one in particular, as if reading from a script. Small issue, that was their word for it. But Thomas understood. It wasn't just a policy check. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to the quiet corners of bias that still lived in polished airports and smiling uniforms. And in that reflection, some truths were impossible to ignore. He didn't need to fight. The real fight, he knew, was older than him. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, not like a man reaching for proof, but like a man who already knew the ending to the story. With steady fingers, he tapped to contact. 1 ring, then 2. "Maggie," he said calmly, "pull up the supply contract we signed with Meridian Air. The Western Routes deal, the big one." He listened for a beat. "Yes. I'm standing at JFK, Gate 22. No, there's no issue with the ticket, but I think there's about to be an issue with how this airline handles people they don't recognize." He said nothing else. No threats, no raised voice. He simply ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Behind the counter, the gate agent cast a sideways glance. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, as if she had just realized the air had shifted, but couldn't quite name why. And still, Thomas waited. Calm, motionless. His stillness was louder than anything he could have shouted. Can a man's silence sometimes speak louder than a crowd? That's what this moment became, not about confrontation, but quiet consequence. The call wasn't a cry for help, it was a signal, a reminder that respect, once broken, has a cost, and that some people don't carry business cards. They carry weight. Passengers were starting to murmur now, not loudly, but enough to tilt the atmosphere, the kind of tension that crawls under your skin when people realize something's wrong, and no one knows who to blame. But Tomas wasn't playing for the crowd. He was playing for the truth. And the truth was already moving, through hallways, into offices, onto desks far above Gate 22. The clock hadn't stopped. But the story had just begun to turn. 10 floors above the boarding gate, in a glass-walled office overlooking the runway, Cynthia Holt was midway through a black coffee and a spreadsheet of flight operations, when her assistant rushed in, eyes wide. "There's a situation at Gate 22, he said, breath tight. "A passenger's being held up. Name's Thomas Ellison." Cynthia froze. The name landed hard. She had just signed his company, Ellison Harvest Group, to a multi-million-dollar contract to overhaul the airline's food services. Farm to flight, clean produce, a new brand image. And now, this. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed her blazer and moved fast, heels tapping like warnings through the corridor. On her way down, her phone buzzed. Legal, marketing, PR, all ringing at once. Because when a partner like Thomas is stalled at a gate, it isn't just bad optics. It's a burning match in a room full of gasoline. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, Thomas remained unmoved, still near the window, still waiting. Passengers were boarding now, awkwardly quiet, casting glances like questions they were too afraid to ask. The gate agent Haley glanced nervously at her screen, pretending to search, but searching for nothing. Have you ever watched someone try to hide their mistake behind a keyboard? The pressure was mounting. Behind the scenes, execs whispered down hallways. At headquarters, the legal team scrambled, realizing just how close they were to losing a partner that fed their future. And still, Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to raise his voice. That call had already moved hands on the clock. By the time Cynthia stepped onto the concourse, flanked by a senior operations manager, the tension was thick enough to cut. She spotted him instantly, calm, still, dignified. And in that moment she understood. This wasn't a delay. This was a reckoning. "Mr. Ellison?" Cynthia's voice was calm, low, and urgent. Thomas turned slowly, not surprised. He didn't blink when she introduced herself as the executive director of regional operations. He already knew who would be coming. He had simply been waiting for them to catch up. "I'd like to speak with you in private," she said. He nodded once. No rush, no indignation. Just a measured step away from the gate, as if this were a business meeting and not a public mistake unraveling in real time. Cynthia apologized, sincerely, explained the misunderstanding, offered to escort him aboard personally. Thomas studied her for a moment, then asked one question. "Do you know what seat I was assigned?" She checked her tablet. "Seat 1A. A quiet smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Interesting," he said, "because I was just told this lane was for premium passengers only." The pause that followed was heavy, not angry, just heavy. Because the moment wasn't about boarding, it was about belief. Have you ever been looked at not for who you are, but for who someone decided you couldn't be? Cynthia nodded, ashamed, but Thomas didn't press. He didn't need to. He turned to look toward the desk. Haley, the gate agent, stood, stiff-faced, pale, headset dangling uselessly. She shrank behind the counter, still gripping his ID like a shield. He didn't say a word to her, but sometimes silence can echo louder than scolding. He handed Cynthia a folder, a copy of the signed contract. "This isn't about me," he said quietly. "It's about the next person who doesn't have my phone number or this piece of paper." And then, almost gently, "Fix it, not for me, for them." Then he stepped forward, handed over his boarding pass, and walked toward the jet bridge. Not triumphant, not defeated, just steady. The kind of walk that reminds you, dignity doesn't ask for a spotlight. It brings its own light with it. Back in the terminal, the gate resumed boarding, slowly, awkwardly. No announcement was made, but everyone could feel the shift. Haley had disappeared. Her headset was gone. So was her name from the duty roster by morning. But there was no press release, no public fallout, no headline shouting "CEO denied boarding." Thomas Ellison hadn't posted, tweeted, or told a soul. Not out of fear, out of focus. He wasn't chasing attention. He was chasing better. By the time the flight touched down in San Francisco, he'd already answered 3 work emails and confirmed his schedule for the summit. Not a word about Gate 22, not even to Maggie, who had fielded a dozen calls from Meridian's executive board in the meantime. He walked off the plane quietly, garment bag over his shoulder, the same way he boarded. Measured, composed, eyes steady. A few passengers looked up, recognizing him now, but Thomas didn't pause for applause. Instead, he headed straight to the hotel ballroom where his keynote was scheduled. No drama, no delays, just business. His speech that afternoon wasn't about race or boarding passes or airport gates. It was about resiliency food systems. But somewhere in the last third, he looked up from his notes and said, "Sometimes the breakdown in a supply chain doesn't start with equipment or weather. Sometimes it starts with a bad assumption, one that leads us to trust the wrong systems, or to dismiss the right people." There was a pause. Have you ever taken a shortcut in how you judge someone, and only realized it when it was too late? The room was silent, not from discomfort, but understanding. When he stepped off the stage, a young researcher approached and said quietly, "I think I needed to hear that more than I thought." Thomas nodded. "Then I'm glad I said it. Because when you speak from lived truth, even quiet words carry weight." Weeks passed. There was no viral video, no public statement, no corporate scandal. But the story didn't fade. It lingered, in whispers behind break room doors at Meridian Air, in soft conversations between supervisors and gate agents who began second-guessing their instincts before reaching for a headset. Something had shifted, and it began not with outrage, but with a man who stood still. A photo quietly circulated within industry circles. Thomas Ellison, standing near gate 22, phone to his ear, face calm, body still. The caption read, "He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move, but the whole airport listened." The airline never made a public confession, but internally, things changed. A new partnership was announced with the Civil Rights Advisory Board. Sensitivity training policies were rewritten. Hiring protocols reviewed. In corporate memos, the word bias appeared more than it ever had. No one said Thomas's name. They didn't need to. He hadn't demanded an apology, hadn't asked for compensation. When GQ requested an interview, he told Maggie, "Tell them I'm busy feeding people." Because for Thomas, justice didn't mean a headline. It meant prevention. Quiet, lasting change. Isn't that what real strength looks like? Not how loudly you fight, but how deeply you're remembered. Back home in Cleveland, an older woman named Clara Ellison, his mother, read a short column in a business ethics magazine that hinted at what happened. She smiled quietly, put the paper down on the table, and said to no one in particular, "That's my son." She'd raised him on groceries and grace. No silver spoons, just straight spines and strong hands. And now, her boy had changed an airline, not with fury, but with stillness. Not everyone saw it, but the ones who needed to, they saw it clearly. And that's all that ever mattered. Sometimes the deepest kind of strength is the one that says nothing, just stands firm, quiet, and unshaken. Thomas Ellison didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He let the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, he reminded us that dignity doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. In a world that often rushes to judge by appearance, by title, or by the color of someone's skin, his story teaches us a simple but profound lesson. What we assume about others says more about us than it does about them. We've all made snap judgments in our lives. Maybe we've been on the receiving end. Maybe we've looked at someone and thought we already knew their story. But what if, instead, we paused? What if we gave people room to show us who they are before deciding who they're not? Respect, after all, isn't something we offer only to those we recognize. It's something we choose to give because it's right. And sometimes the most lasting change doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing still, steady in our truth, and letting the world catch up. He didn't win by shouting. He won by standing. Thomas Ellison's quiet power wasn't made for applause. It was the kind that lives in the bones of a man who's carried injustice too long to let it shape him. He walked onto that plane not with triumph, but with grace. Not with anger, but with truth. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, policies changed. Sensitivity trainings were rewritten. Quiet conversations began to stir in hallways and boardrooms. Conversations that should have started long ago. The ripple he left behind wasn't loud, but it was lasting, because sometimes justice doesn't come crashing in. Sometimes it arrives in stillness and stays. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.